That archaic shack is a blight on our community, Brenda Sterling declared, her voice echoing off the beige walls of the community center, effectively signing her own social death warrant, though she didn't know it yet. 6 months later, it wasn't my cabin that was gone, it was Brenda, along with her pristine gazebo, her granite driveway, and her iron-fisted reign as HOA president. I stood there, staring at the demolition notice trembling in my hand, feeling a heat rising in my chest that wasn't just anger. It was something primal, a visceral rejection of the audacity, the sheer, unadulterated gall of a woman who thought a plastic badge gave her the right to erase history. The Cedar Hollow Association was demanding I bulldoze my grandpa Arthur's 1954 Craftsman studio within 48 hours, or face fines that would bankrupt me in a month, threatening to place a lien on the very soil my family had bled for. I remember laughing, a dry, humorless sound, as I read the legalese dripping with artificial authority, because these pompous bureaucrats, comfortable in their climate-controlled bubbles, had absolutely no idea who they were picking a fight with, nor did they realize that they had been happily building their little suburban empire on my family's land for years without permission. Let me take you back to the beginning, before the lawyers and the screaming matches. My name is Ethan, and 6 months ago, I inherited a slice of heaven in Cedar Hollow, 2 acres of rolling green, a main house, and that historic cabin where Grandpa Arthur taught me the difference between a Phillips and a flathead. Arthur was a Korean War vet who came back to the States with a ringing in his ears and a need for silence, clearing every tree on this lot by hand, mixing the concrete, and stacking those cedar logs one by one to build a sanctuary where the smell of sawdust and old tobacco still hangs in the air like a ghost you want to hug. Back then, Cedar Hollow wasn't a subdivision, it was farmland, a place where neighbors were practically family and fences were just suggestions. But the sprawl came, as it always does, swallowing the hills with cookie-cutter McMansions named Willow Creek Estates and Sovereign Heights, replacing the dirt roads with asphalt and the soul of the place with a homeowners association formed 15 years ago to preserve property values, which is really just code for keeping the neighborhood sterile and uniform. The original families, the few of us left, were grandfathered in, existing in a Cold War with the newcomers who moved here from the city and immediately started measuring grass height with laser levels. And leading the charge was Brenda Sterling, 52, a real estate shark with a white Mercedes SUV and a license plate that read Blessed, though by the end of this, everyone would know the irony of that tag. Brenda had hair sprayed into a helmet of blonde defiance and a husband named Gary, a man who had perfected the art of the silent nod, looking like he was constantly apologizing for existing. Brenda moved here 5 years ago and treated the neighborhood like her personal dollhouse, the kind of woman who times how long your recycling bin sits at the curb. The crunch of her heels on my gravel driveway was the first shot across the bow. It was a Tuesday in March when she arrived for a routine inspection, marching across my property with her iPhone raised like a weapon, snapping photos and muttering about visual harmony. She zeroed in on Arthur's cabin like a heat-seeking missile, barely glancing at the hand-carved eaves before announcing, "This temporary structure violates our community guidelines. Ethan, it has to go." I tried to be diplomatic, explaining that it wasn't temporary, that it had stood there for 70 years, long before her HOA was even a gleam in a developer's eye, telling her about the family history, the memories etched into the floorboards. Brenda just gave me that practiced, pitying smile and delivered the line that sealed her fate. "Well, we have standards now, don't we? It's time to join the modern world." She handed me a 30-day compliance notice and strutted back to her Mercedes, leaving behind a cloud of floral perfume and the stench of entitlement. That night, sitting in Grandpa Arthur's cracked leather armchair, wearing his old welding gloves, I realized this wasn't about a cabin. It was a purge, a systematic removal of anything that didn't fit Brenda's beige fantasy. But she made a critical error in judgment because 2 weeks later, she escalated, cutting my deadline to 14 days by claiming the cabin was an emergency safety hazard. An emergency? The thing had survived blizzards that flattened modern garages, but Brenda brought in a county inspector, a guy she clearly knew from the country club, who poked a screwdriver into one siding board and declared the entire structure condemned and a public danger. Grandpa didn't raise me to roll over for bullies with clipboards. I drained my savings to hire an independent structural engineer, a guy named Mike with hands like catcher's mitts and zero patience for politics. His report was a thing of beauty, proving the cabin was not only sound but exceeded modern load-bearing codes, built with techniques that are lost arts today. While I was at it, I contacted the Heritage Preservation Society, and when they heard a Korean War vet built it, they fast-tracked a historic designation application, proving the structure predated the HOA by decades. Brenda's reaction to the engineering report was textbook narcissism. She couldn't refute the facts, so she moved the goalposts, changing the violation from safety to aesthetic noncompliance, claiming it violated a previously unknown architectural harmony clause enforced by a design committee that conveniently consisted of her and her two best friends. But her aggression was waking up the sleeping giants of the neighborhood. Mrs. Higgins, a retired librarian with a steel trap mind, started digging through old archives, and Carlos Rivera, the mechanic who ran the auto shop down the road, told me Brenda had been targeting him for years too. We realized Brenda had a pattern, targeting the elderly, the working class, anyone who didn't drive a luxury car, while her cronies got away with murder. As I held Grandpa Arthur's original 1954 building permits, feeling the texture of the yellowed paper, I knew this was war. But Brenda wasn't done. She escalated again, cutting the deadline to 48 hours, imposing immediate daily fines, and threatening a lien on my home, launching a smear campaign on the Cedar Hollow Facebook group, posting crop photos to make my property look like a junkyard, asking, "Do you want your property values to plummet because one neighbor refuses to evolve?" I fired back with a formal grievance, pointing out she had skipped mediation, written warnings, and cure periods required by the bylaws, effectively steamrolling due process. I also tipped off David Thorne, an editor at the local Gazette who smelled blood in the water. HOA president targets veterans' legacy is the kind of headline that writes itself. But the real dirt came when I looked into Brenda's finances. She was a realtor exclusively listing homes in Cedar Hollow, meaning every fine she levied, every standard she enforced, was directly manipulating the market to pad her own commissions, a massive conflict of interest she was monetizing to the tune of 6 figures. Brenda panicked, calling an emergency board meeting with only her loyalists, illegally overriding the grievance process to strip me of my appeals, reducing my deadline to immediate demolition. But in her haste, she forgot to notify the residents, and the neighborhood was fracturing. Anonymous notes of support appeared in my mailbox, people too afraid to speak up publicly but desperate for someone to stop her. Carlos even offered me his demolition equipment for free, winking and saying, "Just in case you need to demolish the wrong structure." The pressure was suffocating. Brenda would drive by slowly, twice a day, filming my house, a suburban surveillance state of one. Her husband, Gary, approached me at the gas station, looking like a haunted man, whispering, "She's really serious. Ethan, maybe just compromise," asking me to tear down my heritage to save his marriage. Then came the nuclear option, a sheriff's deputy serving me papers, looking embarrassed as Brenda stood behind him, arms crossed, practically vibrating with glee, threatening to sue me for legal fees, calling my cabin a magnet for undesirables. I was cornered. Lawyers wanted $5,000 just to start, insurance wouldn't cover HOA disputes, and I was staring at financial ruin. That night, I sat in the cabin, surrounded by the smell of cedar, and opened Grandpa Arthur's old journal, reading his words. "Fighting a bear is suicide. Ethan, you have to outsmart it. Lead it to the trap." And that's when I found the metal box hidden behind a loose floorboard, containing the original deed research and surveys from 1954. My heart hammered against my ribs as I unfolded the map. There was a discrepancy, a massive one. According to Arthur's meticulous records, my property line didn't end where the fence was. It extended 50 feet beyond it. If this map was right, half of Brenda's manicured backyard, her driveway, and her beloved gazebo were sitting on my land. While I was processing this bombshell, Carlos dropped another one. Gary had confessed that Brenda was leveraged to the hilt, buying investment properties on credit, terrified that one market dip would ruin them, explaining her desperate, manic need to control property values. The next day, my niece Sophie was playing in the cabin, running her hands along the logs, when Brenda shouted from the fence, Get that child out of that death trap. The fear in Sophie's eyes was the last straw. I spent my last $800 hiring Martha, a surveyor with 30 years of experience and GPS equipment precise to the millimeter. What Martha found didn't just turn the tables, it flipped the entire game board. My property extended exactly 53 feet past the current fence. Brenda's $80,000 landscaping, her driveway, and the HOA's common area, gazebo, were all trespassing on my private property. The development, built in the 70s, had used a flawed baseline survey, and every sales Brenda brokered was based on that error. Her title insurance was about to explode, and legally, I could demand she rip it all out or charge her rent. Fair market rent for that acreage? About $1,200 a month. For 15 years. That's over $200,000. When Brenda got wind that a surveyor was on my land, Gary showed up at my door, shaking, saying, "There must be a mistake. We could lose everything." I realized then that I held the power to destroy them, but Grandpa Arthur's voice echoed in my head. "Make your enemies your allies." I didn't want to ruin Gary. I wanted to break Brenda's tyranny. I assembled my team. Carlos, Mrs. Higgins, and Sergeant Miller, an old friend of my grandfather's who treated this like a tactical operation. We had a 4-phase plan. Phase 1, quiet title action to make the boundaries legal gospel. Phase 2, demand back rent as leverage, not for profit, but for power. Phase 3, restructure the HOA. Phase 4, public exposure. Mrs. Higgins found the smoking gun. 23 documented cases where Brenda fined minorities and single parents while ignoring violations by her friends. It was systematic discrimination. Brenda, sensing the walls closing in, hired a private investigator to follow me, trying to find dirt, but all he found was me buying lottery tickets. She tried to bribe the county supervisor, tried to hike my fines to $500 a day in a secret meeting that Mrs. Higgins infiltrated and documented. She even tried to get my home insurance canceled, but the inspector, Linda, laughed and said the cabin was the strongest structure she'd seen all year. Brenda was spiraling, filing restraining orders that got thrown out, filing complaints with animal control about my bird feeders, while Gary was spotted at a divorce lawyer's office. She scheduled one final execution meeting for the night before my court date, inviting the media, thinking she could shame me into submission. She set the stage for her own public execution, and I was more than happy to attend. The community center was packed, standing room only, 47 households, the reporter David Thorne, and a confused sheriff's deputy. Brenda stood at the front, sweating through her silk blouse, launching into a PowerPoint presentation titled, "Protecting Our Standards," clicking through filtered photos of my cabin, her voice cracking as she talked about equity, while Gary winced in the back row. She moved to authorize legal action and fines that would ruin me, then smirked. "We believe in fair hearings. Ethan, do you have anything to say?" I walked to the front, plugged in my laptop, and said, "Thank you, Brenda. I'd like to show you the actual boundaries of my property." The screen illuminated with the high-definition GPS survey, the red lines cutting right through her backyard, swallowing her gazebo. The room went silent, a vacuum of sound, until a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. "According to this filed survey," I said, my voice steady, "the HOA has no authority over the disputed area because it is not in the subdivision. And Brenda, your driveway is trespassing on my land." Brenda turned a color I didn't know existed, screaming, "That's fake. He bribed them." But I clicked to the next slide. The calculation of $180,000 in back rent and the audio recordings of her trying to bribe inspectors. Then came the screenshots of her discriminatory posts. Mrs. Higgins stood up. I moved to remove Brenda Sterling as president, effective immediately. Carlos seconded. The vote was a landslide, a massacre. Brenda shrieked, "I am the president. I decide," until the deputy stepped in, gently telling her she was disrupting a legal meeting. I offered my terms. I would waive the rent and deed the common area to the HOA in exchange for her resignation, the removal of her improvements from my land, and a complete rewrite of the bylaws. I ended with, "Grandpa Arthur built that cabin to last, and he gave me the tools to ensure no bully ever tears this neighborhood apart again." The applause was deafening. 1 week later, Brenda resigned via a bitter email and moved to Arizona. Gary filed for divorce and moved out. The court ruled in my favor instantly. The new HOA board, led by Mrs. Higgins and Carlos, turned the disputed land into a community garden, and we created a scholarship fund with the fines Brenda was forced to pay the state. You have to understand, the victory wasn't just in the gavel banging down or the look of absolute shock on Brenda's face. It was in the quiet moments that followed, the ones the cameras didn't capture. 2 days after the meeting, while Brenda was likely throwing china at a wall somewhere, I found Gary standing at the edge of my property line, the real property line. He wasn't cowering anymore. He was holding a box of vintage tools, his shoulders set in a way I hadn't seen in 5 years. "These were my dad's," he told me, his voice steady, lacking that frantic tremble he'd developed living under Brenda's reign. "I hid them in the garage attic because Brenda said they were grease magnets and clutter. I want the tool library to have them." He handed over the box, and for the first time, I saw the man he was before the designer suits and the constant apologizing. We didn't hug. We aren't those kinds of guys, but he shook my hand, a firm grip that said thank you for giving me my life back. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about land. It was about liberation. Gary drove off in a beat-up pickup truck he'd bought that morning, leaving the Mercedes behind, and I swear the guy looked 20 years younger. And the cabin? It's become the beating heart of Cedar Hollow. It's not just a library, it's a sanctuary. On Saturday mornings, you don't hear the oppressive silence of a perfect neighborhood anymore. You hear the hum of conversation, the screech of a sander, the laughter of old men teaching young kids how to fix a leaky faucet. Mrs. Higgins started a repair cafe inside, where people bring broken toasters and lamps instead of throwing them away, fighting back against the throwaway culture Brenda worshipped. One rainy afternoon, I was organizing the shelves in the cabin, the smell of rain mixing with that eternal cedar scent, and I found a spot on the wall where Grandpa Arthur had carved his initials next to my grandmother's. I realized then that Brenda wanted to tear this down because it represented something she couldn't buy: permanence, character, love that endures through the cracks and the weathering. We didn't just save a structure. We saved the idea that a home is meant to be lived in, not just looked at. The sterile, beige dictatorship is gone, replaced by something messy, loud, and incredibly beautiful. The neighborhood finally matches the spirit of the man who built this cabin: tough, generous, and impossible to knock down. 6 months later, my niece Sophie brought her class to the cabin. Watching those kids touch the logs Arthur laid by hand, hearing the laughter from the garden where Brenda's gazebo used to be, I found one last note in the journal. The best revenge is building something better. We didn't just save a cabin, we saved the soul of Cedar Hollow. But here is the question that keeps me up at night. Was I too ruthless? I could have just proved the boundary and left it at that, but I chose to dismantle her entire life, her career, and her marriage to protect my home. Does fighting a tyrant justify becoming a destroyer? Or is that simply the price of justice in a world that rewards bullies? Tell me in the comments, because while the victory tastes sweet, I still wonder if Grandpa Arthur would have pulled the trigger or just built a higher fence. Don't forget to subscribe for the story about the city councilman who tried to steal my neighbor's business. That one gets even crazier.